Hello and welcome to Your Library at Home. My name's Sam Hagan and I'm part of the library's public programming team. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we meet on country this evening. I live and work on Gadigal land and I'd like to take this opportunity to pay my respects to elders past, present and especially emerging. I also extend that respect to any Aboriginal Australians who may be joining us this evening. Welcome to you to another fantastic instalment of the Bri Lee Book Club online. We're getting quite used to this. Tonight we've got a very accomplished guest, Liz Allen. We'll be speaking with Bri, and I'm going to hand over to them in just a moment. But before I do, I'd just like to remind you that this month we have two Bri Lee book clubs because one's never enough. So if you haven't registered, please make sure you head over to the library's website after watching this and register for our next date, which is on the 25th of June. I'm sure Bri will give you another reminder. So I'll see you again to moderate the Q&A, but for now, I'd like to hand over to the amazing Bri. Bri, are you with us?
Good evening. Hello, Sam. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us again for this month's B-List Book Club. I also am coming to you from, you would now recognise my lounge room in Sydney, which is on what always was and always will be Aboriginal land, Gadigal land in particular. It's extra important to acknowledge that this evening. 2020 has been a year of many unprecedented things, but I think it's fair to say that what is happening around the world at the moment is an unprecedented level of wider public engagement with race issues. Obviously, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in Australia have been talking about deaths in custody for a long time, but I think it's fair to say that it is unprecedented how much the wider population and media are now talking about those issues as well, obviously kicked off from the issues with regards to race relations in America. And I mention all this because it seems like, unfortunately, facts and statistics are a rare delicacy in 2020, and it has been a real silver lining of COVID-19 that the State Library of New South Wales have made it so that these events can be free and that everyone around the country and even potentially internationally can come and listen. So if you missed last month's, I got to talk to Sand Talk author Tyson Yunkaporta about how incredible Aboriginal thinking, Indigenous thinking and knowledge patterns and attitudes are and how they can save the world. And tonight we're hearing from demographer Dr. Liz Allen about her book, The Future of Us. And I think this is another really important book that I so enjoyed reading that I just wish, it's one of those books that I just wish everyone had read. Liz Allen is a demographer and social researcher teaching research methods and researching population dynamics at the ANU Centre for Social Research and Methods. She uses her analytic skills to provide much needed information about data, for example, the Census and Marriage Postal Survey, or population dynamics, for example, immigration and fertility. Liz has written numerous pieces for The Conversation, scholarly articles in academic journals, and contributions to research reports. She was named in the inaugural ABC Top 5 Humanities and Social Sciences Academics in Australia 2018. She can be found on social media under the alter ego of Dr. Demography, and she can be found here this evening. Liz, are you with us?
I am. Hello. I come to you from Canberra, and I assure you that there are humans in Canberra. We are not just a place. And I would also like to acknowledge that I come to you from Aboriginal land. I am presently on Ngunnawal country. So I'm so excited to be with you virtually. And it's fantastic that we have this opportunity that through, I guess, the ashes of COVID rises something magnificent, and that is a more accessible and a opportunity for people to engage with all sorts of mediums from wherever they sit. I'm presently in front of a spotty background which hides the mess of my daughter's bedroom, my 12-year-old's bedroom. So you can imagine that for someone like me, I usually can't do these nighttime activities. So even for me, through the ashes comes something quite magnificent.
I could not agree more, and I'm so thrilled you can join us. Given the current socio-political climate, I want to dive straight into one of the things I found most valuable about your book, Liz, which was the way it explained the history and the not so distant history, i.e. the still present effects of the White Australia policy. And you use the word enduring in particular, which I think is important. So could you, explain like I'm 5, imagine it's a total newbie to these issues, explain really what the White Australia policy was, and take as long as you need to answer, and why you use the word enduring, what your work tells us about how it is still very much present in Australia.
Wow, I could take forever talking about this one, but let me start is with this very simple fact that in Australia we have a Black history. From the very first migration of people, the very first establishment of a human population or human populations on this land, our history has been a Black history. The First Nations of this country are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And they, through very sophisticated engineering and seafaring, navigated their way to establish populations across this land that lived and were nourished by this land and looked after this land. When it was disrupted, this land was disrupted and the peoples residing on it by colonisation. And in Australia, we'll only like to think that we have a white history and that our history began the moment the colonisers set foot on this land, and that it was one of peace and that it was one of welcoming feelings. And yes, that's right. That's right. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't peaceful. It was, if we look at the population of what we think is probably the most likely estimated population of First Nations Australians just on the mainland, we see an enormous drop. If you think of the graph of First Nations population, the moment colonisation happens, the population just, it dips, and it does so in the most extraordinary way. And the word genocide, I think, could be used and used conservatively in this regard. We don't acknowledge that. We don't teach that in schools. We don't teach the idea of having children stolen, cultures stolen, because that's essentially what happens when we remove children. We remove connections to land, to culture, to all sorts of things, and the loss of language and the loss of culture and familial networks is the death for many cultures and many societies, and that's that's not something that the colonisers went into, I guess, naive, if you like, and it's something we don't acknowledge. So let's get to this idea of a white Australia, the idea that we established this nation the day that British colonisers set foot, and they, the narrative in Australia is commonly recounted as one where the colonisers came and they brought wonderful technologies, and they
medicine.
Yes, and they freed the Aboriginal people from this kind of idea of living in the Stone Age. This is so untrue. This is so far from the true. It's horrible. And it's a myth that sits nicely with in this idea of a white Australia, this kind of idea of a eugenic. With whiteness comes superiority, both in terms of intellect and in terms of breeding stock, and to that kind of drive, then you can then see if that's established as what's the best and what is therefore less, via this kind of notion of eugenics. We've then seen policy over time, specifically the White Australia policy, which has taken different guises over the years, but it's essentially to maintain a white Australia. And even though the White Australia policy ended, and it basically, it dictated who could come, I'm going to use a phrase that we commonly hear now, who can come to this country and when and by what means. Okay, it's a narrative that has echoed throughout Australia's history, is that we want to tightly control the language and the look and the stock, if you like, of the people that come to Australia. It ended in the 70s, long before I'm sure some of the panelists tonight were even born. Yet we still have an enduring white Australia mentality. This idea that we recognise ourselves as white Australians, a white nation with maybe a hiccup along the road. We don't recognise that we have a black history, and our history is so rich and so far back. And then what happens when we deny that history? We establish a new narrative of truth, and we're seeing that echo again in history and in contemporary time now. But what's so fascinating about the enduring impacts of White Australia policy is, even though the policy is long gone, I was not born during the policy, I was born after the policy, but my parents were born and raised during the White Australia policy. Funnily enough, my mother grew up near a camp of people of displaced people who were being resettled after World War II. And even though she had interactions with people from diverse backgrounds, she still believed that this idea of a White Australia policy, and more importantly, that it was one's birthright as being a white Australian to reap the benefits and be the only ones reaping the benefits of those rewards as a birthright. What then happens is that by the conversations that we share over the dinner table, the kitchen sink conversations, the general kind of unconscious interactions we have, establish this idea, whether we're aware of it or not, that's the unconscious part of it, that this white Australia is the norm and should be held up as a continuing foundation of our society. What then happens is anyone that looks different or sounds different is othered. We other people. And our recent migration, it's easy or easier to tell someone apart. And what then happens is discrimination is more easily unleashed. And that's certainly what we're seeing at the moment with regard to people of Asian ancestry in Australia. And then we again lie to ourselves and like to establish ourselves as being a nation of white people with a birthright to this land. And more importantly, we're even seeing and hearing now that if you're born in Australia, you are Indigenous. That's so not true. And it's this idea that, if it hurts, and if it hurts me, I can't imagine what it feels like to be someone who has through generations had children removed from their home, removed from their family. It burns in a way that it changes our genetic makeup in an epigenetic way, which means that there's trauma lasting on and on. And any people that come to Australia, new migrants, they have to prove themselves to be worthy by Australian standards. And it's almost a fault that they weren't born here.
I feel obliged and delighted to even have a horrific example from this morning where our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, that said that Australia never had slavery, and somehow painted a very false binary of the kind of race issues in America not being relevant to the Australian context, which is absolutely a lie. And as much as I would love to rant about that, you can just Google slavery in Australia and read the Wikipedia article. And also I remembered I was supposed to mention at the beginning, as with every month, we have a Q&A function. So as Liz and I are talking, if you have a question, there should be a little window you can see at the bottom where you can type a question, and Sam is checking those as we go along. So Liz, back to the numbers, your specialty. Can you talk to us about the enormity of 1971 being the first time that there was a real census, i.e. the first time that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders were counted? The enormity in terms of, yes, the cultural and social significance, but also that it was, the first time that we could actually get to know what that part of Australia was actually doing.
It's really hard when we don't recognize something, we don't identify it, we don't count it, we kind of send a signal that it doesn't matter. When we count something, it matters, it's there on paper, we cannot get away from it. And until that census, even in our births registration statistics, our death registrations, which kind of took us some time to really show accurate representations of what was going on, we could hide behind the reality of what was happening. So the idea that when through a census we can count and we can measure, we validate. Because if you're not counted, you don't count. And through census, much of our policy and our funding infrastructure is based upon that. So if we don't know through this national survey of our people, of Australian people, what's happening in this country, how can we adequately understand the needs of people? And think about it in the way of homelessness, thinking in the terms of languages and other cultures. If they're not represented and counted in the census, how do we know they exist? It's almost as if we can shut our eyes and pretend that there is no population there, or there are no issues there. And for me, a lot of people don't like the census. I acknowledge that, but for me, the census is a thoroughly empowering thing, because it enables me to do my work and enables me to bear witness to what's happening, and more importantly, use that data to argue and to advocate for change. I was missed in the 1996 census. I was homeless. And so for me, the census means something more than just a count. I make sure I'm counted because my value is seen in the data, I guess. And I'm hidden in the data. You can't work out who I am within the data, but I'm there. And I'm there and I represent who I am, and my characteristics are seen. And for me, that as an individual, that's powerful, but for communities can show via the census and via these sorts of data collections, there's need and there is lacking infrastructure and resources. It's important that we recognise we've still not got the data infrastructure right, but we're getting there. And I think that's an important recognition. We count what matters, and what we matters counts.
As well as obviously colonialism and racism being inexcusable and horrific in and of themselves, you write about how xenophobia costs our country economically as well. I want to talk about this. Can you talk to us, I guess, give us a bit of an introduction to some of the ideas you talk about in your book about how essentially white supremacy, ironically, is costing Australia, given the people who seem to spout these ideas do so from the backing of wanting to protect their country, or what they think of as their country.
So at the basis, in my view, at the basis of xenophobia is not just fear of the other, but it's fear that someone else is getting a go at something that is rightfully yours, or they're getting first dibs at something that is rightfully yours. Certainly that's my observation within the context of Australia. And what we're seeing is people, say, for example, are saying, well, and we're seeing this borne in the data, that this attitude that people, migrants are welfare bludgers and getting access to things, and I'm paying for it, right, as an Australian. That's not the case, but that's certainly not the case. Migrants aren't welfare bludgers at all. In fact, they can't qualify for welfare as a stipulation of their visa and entry into Australia. But we see people looking around, fearing for the plight of their own family, of their own future, and concerned about what's being taken away from them. What then happens is we have this flow-on impact of hatred and fear, whether it's verbal or even non-verbal ways of people. We don't want particular interactions with the world. We want to shut ourselves off and become an island where we are not part of the globalized world. We don't want to partake in the economic riches that we can. Our student intake, for example, is caught up in all sorts of xenophobic concepts and ideas. It's harmful for individuals, it's harmful for others, but more importantly, we have an aging population. And for young people, at the moment, we don't have enough people going into the workforce, replacing those exiting through aging. Okay. Now, that's not an issue on its own. And there is much benefit from an aging population. We are, after all, successful. But it becomes very, very intense and very difficult for young people to then have to juggle. Do I start a family? Can I buy a house? Can I do all of these things, but also contribute to the economic well-being of the nation, like I'm being told to do? Those pushing and pulling, our xenophobic responses to immigration, means that we can't have the immigration necessary to offset the needs of the population to enable the lifestyle and the well-being of young people coming through the life course tunnel, if you like.
You talked in the book about how the word like population is often used so that people don't have to use the word migration, essentially. And I would love for you to sort of explain that for anyone who hasn't read the book. But also you mentioned that anytime you speak at all about population and basically your area of expertise, that you get, I guess, what we could just call hate mail. And I wanted to know, like, what are the kind of themes of the sort of common, I guess, fears or concerns that people have that you can sort of pick through from that correspondence?
Yeah, so when we hear the idea of a population debate, and gosh, have we had many population debates in Australia, but when we say population, people don't really mean people. We're talking about one element of population, and that's immigration, because there's more than just immigration as an input to population growth. Population grows if we look at the balancing equation through births and the net balance of births and deaths. We call that natural increase. And then, of course, immigration, net overseas migration, which is the balance of people leaving and people coming into the country. When we talk about population at the moment, and population growth has become another obsession, whether we're growing too fast, we're only focusing on one chunk of that growth, and that's the growth due to immigration. It is the largest share of our population growth at the moment, but it hasn't always been. And we see that the conversation about population, which is really about immigration, really takes over at the time that immigration, that in part of that balancing equation, took over as the leading contribution to growth versus natural increase. But if we look at natural increase, people aren't saying stop having babies. Hey, ladies, stop having babies. In fact, we're hearing the opposite. Ladies.
Particularly from Tony Abbott. I'm sorry. I feel like that man is obsessed with the fact that as a white 28-year-old, I haven't had a baby yet. Every time he talks, I just feel like he's asking me that like I'm responsible for the fall of Western civilization because I am not reproducing.
It's all on you. It's totally on you. Now we know the answer. Whether you know what, and this is the other thing too, I'm going off on a bit of a tangent, but when we think about demography and we think about the dynamics of population change, women cop a flogging. We are problematized. We are the problem. We're either saviors or problem makers when it comes to having too many, enough, the right kinds of babies. Are they middle-class babies? Are they white babies? Are they, this obsession is gross. But that's the women bear the brunt of that because the focus is on obviously the carrier of the baby, and our policy hasn't adjusted to that. But we'll get back to this idea of immigration, of population being code for immigration. And I think that a lot of people will say, and we see this kind of rhetoric. I think Pauline Hanson, and she did something quite magical again today. I think was it the calling for a motion to say that all lives matter.
Yeah, it's been a big day. For dumb comments by politicians.
and so, but it's true to form for Pauline because she tried to get a motion up that it was okay to be white as well. So it's this idea, a fear of loss of dominance, right? This idea that one's dominance and the dominant culture is losing traction and will be overtaken by the other. And another popular myth is that people from different religious backgrounds, for people of Muslim faith, Islamic faith, and coming from so-called Muslim countries, are going to outbreed the local population. So it's this fear that someone else is getting or will get a better go at the piece of the pie than someone else. And I think that that's the inherent fear. And that suits politicians nicely because when we look at popular politics, populism, this idea that we can leverage a vote or we can leverage a particular narrative based on these fears, it works well for politicians. We can quickly, easily flick that immigration switch and hello, we're all of a sudden got this idea of congestion in our cities being code for too many people, but people, the wrong sort of people. And that affects poorer people as well, not just people that are visibly other or from migrant backgrounds.
One thing that I really loved reading about in your book was how this fear of fullness, or that there is like a sort of finite amount of resources in Australia that only migrants would take from, which, as you mentioned, is not even true because we don't allow them to access the welfare system. What I really loved reading about the data you showed in terms of what areas of the current Australian population by age specifically are more or less afraid of these migrant waves. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so if we go back to where we started this conversation, we started with this idea of an enduring white Australia. If we look at the opinions held by people by age strata across Australia, in particular on matters involving immigration and migrants and attitudes towards whether or not we're having our migrant intake is too high or too low or about right, whether migrants are taking locals' jobs, whether overcrowding is an issue, and whether migrants contribute on balance positive impacts, or whether migration is making us a stronger nation. There are a few others as well. If we look at how the opinions vary by age, there is most definitely an age gradient. And that is that as we age, or older people and mainly 65 plus have much stronger views in comparison with younger, so for example, new adults. There is a very much a movement towards the displeasure and concern over migrants and how migrants are changing Australia. Whereas when we look at young
love to
people,
show, can I just show to, just for anyone who hasn't read the book yet, this bottom graph in particular is just such a strong visual representation of, you can see that inverse relationship between the relationship of older and younger people having those attitudes.
And those attitudes, and these are, if you have a look at the surveys that are done annually by leading organisations, it shows an interesting pattern over time, and particularly how policy and public discourse can influence public opinion. But that age gradient and as you said, that kind of inverse relationship between the positives and the negatives, young people are more likely to support immigration and are not afraid of migrants stealing their jobs. Let me say that again. Younger people tend not to be frightened of migrants stealing their jobs, right? Now, what do you hear mostly in the narrative when it comes to immigration? That migrants are stealing local and young locals' jobs, right? It's not the case. And so I wonder whether we do become more conservative with age. Data does show that we do become more conservative with age. On average, okay, on average, but it's also this creeping idea of the enduring, the things that we grow up through, the things that we're exposed to, the norms that we are entrenched in us as we grow, stick with us on a fundamental level, and we can see that span out in these sorts of data. What's more interesting is if we look at the profile of the Australian electorate as a chunk, if we look at the age distribution of Australian voters, it's more skewed toward the older end of the life course. And politicians since Howard have made no kind of qualms about kind of coming out and saying, you know, we're riding the grey vote, so to speak, because it's a nice lump of they're not all the same in terms of characteristics in each phase of the life course, but it's easy to leverage particular elements of our history, and it's easily done via popular politics for this older age group by sheer fact of shared experiences.
I was exactly about to ask you about that as well, because it's important to note that you give examples in the book of Bill Shorten as well as Scott Morrison in the lead up to the last election, basically throwing out bait for these ideas of fullness and of job stealing and everything. It is very much, as you said, since Howard, there has just been this huge voting bloc with very conservative attitudes towards population, i.e. migration. And it hasn't been one particular side of the aisle that are willing to go after that.
In fact, it's easy politics. It's easy to play, and it's who can't agree with the idea that everyone should get a fair go. Every Australian should get a fair go, right? And then when we say, well, hang on a second, should every young Australian get a fair go before someone else, right? And that's then the kind of easy pickings. And we've seen that again just recently with Keneally's comment. Happens with those sorts of comments in their own right, they may not be a problem, but they open a door and allow us almost like an invitation. Hey, guess what? It's okay to share these sorts of views, and it's okay to maybe share some views that and voice them that perhaps you think that others might be, you know, thinking don't be saying that. Say those things, share amongst ourselves. It's a happy place here. But then what happens is people are more invited and feel free to be more discriminatory in their approaches. The thing is that when we're thinking about young people and education and employment, we're thinking about whether this competition between migrants and locals, right? We don't ever think that migrants are complementary and help fund the education, the training and the support of young Australians coming through the ranks. Too often, and on the other side of that, we often just see migrants as economic suitcases of money, coming to the shore and helping us. We need to change that conversation and shift it into one which is more helpful. The fact is that we are going to rely on migrants into the future. We are going to need to ensure that Australia is a welcoming country and is viewed as such. We're already seeing China, for whatever reason, issuing instructions to students not to come to Australia. It's becoming very, the racist and the xenophobic attacks are coming to the fore, definitely through COVID. We need to change that narrative, and we're not doing very well at doing that. And if you look at the way policy and practice dishes out money, women, young people and migrants are the ones that don't share the wealth, right? And if we think about then what gets left, it's the blokes.
I just remember the
Aussie blokes.
I just remember the third dumb politician thing. That guy today, I can't even remember who it was. Who I didn't even recognize his name. Who said
Rennick.
that was? Yeah. Dorothy didn't tap her red heels together and go to childcare and dream of childcare or something like.
There's no place like home. This is the same guy, right? So Rennick is an LNP senator, and his maiden speech, basically, he stood up and he likened migrants to livestock overcrowding paddocks. Yes. So he has. So I guess I feel comforted that he's also got a thing for women as well. That he doesn't like women being in jobs and being comforted by and supported by childcare. And here's the thing, right? This going back to this idea of problematizing women. Women are seen as the saviors. We're trying to increase our productivity and as a nation, and trying to increase government coffers to be able to fund the lifestyle we've become accustomed to. The key to that for many years has been women and increasing women's labour force participation rates. But what's the quick fix to do that? It's childcare. And it's also nice that childcare, right? If we look at the life course of a person, foundations of education start in early childhood. They start in childcare. So there might be no place like home, but it's rather no place like home at the end of the day, because there's learning and there's work to be done, and there's so much there that if we want to ensure that our population is the best that we can be at the end of the day, we need to ensure that we're educated, because your education determines your health. And those two things determine the lot in life that you then lead and pass on to your children.
What was that example you gave in the book about that really offensive and crappy government inquiry into why Australian women weren't having babies anymore?
Yes. So,
because it feels like nothing's changed.
No, and this is the thing, right? So there was an inquiry just before the Second World War, investigating why birth rates were declining. And so this idea is, basically the findings were that women were selfish and lazy, and so not having children. Again, women bearing the weight of the population in their womb or on their shoulders. If you're either having too many children, not enough, or not the right kinds of children. It's a really nasty situation. But if we look at inquiries through history, if we look at the impact of access to contraception, access to other sorts of support, education for women and things like that, there have been many fears that allowing women full participation in society is going to be the end of us. It's not the end of us. It enables a much richer version of us. And more importantly, we open up the doors to possibilities that we would not have seen before.
We have about 5 minutes left of you and I chatting before I would really love to spend a proper 10 minutes on audience Q&A. If there aren't enough questions from people at home, I have about 50 more. But I really wanted to make sure I left time to talk about you personally and your personal approach to this work. For anyone watching at home who hasn't bought or read the book yet, there is a very, very beautiful and moving introduction to this book that is very personal to you, Liz. One of the phrases that you then used towards the end of the book is, demography got me out of the gutter. So I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about how, certainly in the book, the impression you give is that young you, and you mentioned earlier this evening that at the 96 census you were homeless, why young you did not think that you would end up where you are today.
I didn't win the lottery of life, and the circumstances of one's birth heavily influences the outcome of their life. We are a story of our own demography. Demography may not be destiny. It's actually a little bit more complicated than that. But the circumstances of our birth determines and sets in train the rest of our life. I was born into a large family. My childhood was marked by abuse, an abuse that was covered up by the church and by my own family. That then set in, then kind of triggered a series of events where I became removed from the home at about 14 and kind of bounced around various places from there on. And then at 16, my parents, 8 days after my 16th birthday, my parents decided enough was enough and called the police and had me removed from the home. And that started a moment of really, really difficult times for me. And I honestly thought I'd die in a gutter. I honestly thought that I would never accomplish any of those dreams. We carry dreams with us, around with us as a kid. You know, I didn't have much growing up, but I dreamed that I was more than what the world saw me as. And I could never understand why people couldn't see my value. And I guess people, until I found demography, if you like, I sound like a born-again demographer. until I found demography, I always believed that maybe it was me. I was deficient. There was something inherently wrong with me. Demography enabled me the knowledge and the power to understand that my circumstances were one of what had occurred to me and a structural problem, not my own. And with that, I feel like I lifted the weight off my shoulders. I can put on my demography cape and I'm freed from the gutter. I may have lost the ovarian lottery of life, but I hope that in my lifetime, my children and subsequent generations won't be bound by the circumstances of their birth, and my demography cape will get me from the gutter and will help me help those that find themselves either literally or metaphorically still there.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It's also the thing my final question for you, I suppose, before we go to some audience Q&A, is how important do you think it is to have people like yourself from not so privileged backgrounds in these roles as demographers? Because certainly there is an overwhelming trend in sort of the academy, or in these sort of, you know, what most of the country think of as these sort of think tanks in Canberra, and these professorship roles and researcher roles, that they're all already, you know, privileged rich folk who then shape and do the research. How important is it to make sure that and how can we expand the pool of people who are doing these really important work that you do?
We need to be able to see ourselves reflected in government, and we need, the same goes for research. We need to be able to see that there are opportunities for people like me in that position. I can dream to be there, and someone's already paved the way and proven it to be possible. That's one side of it. So our dream and our aspirations can actually be realised and visualised. But the other side is that the type of research that we do is led by our own bias often, and our own experiences. If we don't come at an issue with those things in mind, with the voice of the poor kid that sits in the back pocket, that can be kind of unleashed on the Cape at will, we are only going to hear the same boring old stories about ourselves as a nation, the white elite stories of the boys that get a good work because of their rich parents, who then go on to become politicians and making decisions for a population based on what they've known to be the case. We need to have that greater representation, and we need people to be able to change and give demography a makeover in the way that we measure things, so that we're not problematizing women purely because they're the ones with the uterus.
Wonderful. Sam, are you there? And do you have questions from the audience? Because if not, I'll chat all night.
I have quite a few questions.
Okay.
Surprisingly. I like that we're all going to be born again demographers. That hit home. So our first question here is, someone said, I didn't know that homeless people were excluded from the census, although it makes horrific sense. Can you just confirm that and talk a bit more about it and how it affects policy versus homelessness issues?
So the questioner is right. We now do a much better job at measuring and gauging homelessness. And in fact, the latest census shows, 2016 shows a greater understanding, because the definition of homelessness was used in a more broad way. So you could literally be living on a street with people that are homeless because of the definition change. So homelessness is not just about rough sleepers, it's about people that live in overcrowded homes, couch surfers, among other things. But in 1996, we weren't very good at counting homelessness, and I lived in a squat. It wasn't a known squat, so it wasn't a place that enumerators could come and easily gauge how many people living there. We did have measurements of homelessness some years back, but over time it's gotten more refined and better. So the latest census data shows a much more appropriate measure and gives us a greater idea of homelessness. But there are still issues of potential that we're not counting. And as time goes on, I'm sure we'll get better at correcting that.
There's a couple of questions about COVID. I'm going to go with this one first. The question is, in general, what impact do you expect COVID will have on Australia's population and demography in the medium to long term?
So I definitely remember those things, the two sides of the balancing equation of natural increase and immigration. They'll both be impacted. So in terms of natural increase, in terms of births, in times of crises, we see, particularly if we look at the Great Depression, birth rates typically fall during times of uncertainty. People will delay, postpone, or forego having children. I suspect we're more likely to see people forego having children. So there's likely to be missing children in our demography, children that won't be had because of COVID.
Don't tell
and
Tony.
those uncertainties. Yeah. Oh, be careful.
Look out.
And guess what? The idea that baby bonuses means people are going to pump out bubbies, it doesn't happen. The research shows that's not the case. So sorry, Peter Costello, your cash bonus. People weren't having babies for plasma TVs, right? So once our birth rates fall, it's very difficult to get them back up again, right? So that's a worry. Childcare, people, would be a good investment there. And on the other side, immigration, we're already seeing immigration obviously fallen significantly, and it will take a little while to rebound purely as a function of border closures. So we're going to see all elements of the population balancing equation impacted. Doesn't mean our population will decline. Definitely we'll likely still see growth. I'm certain we'll still see growth. But if we continue, and if COVID and uncertainty continues beyond, say, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, then we're going to see very significant impacts on the population, but not quite yet.
And this question kind of links to that. The question is in light of the chapter on migration. This person's curious about any models or research that you might be working on regarding decreasing migration from COVID. She's a teacher and her students are studying scientific models next, and she would really like to be able to share current research with them. So maybe pointers for her. Okay, so when we talk about what our population in the future might be, we're not talking about forecasts, we're talking about projections. Projections are only as good as the assumptions that underpin them. The assumptions are about the changes, those dynamics of change, the natural increase in immigration. At the moment, there are researchers, you'll be very pleased to know this, from Melbourne and from UQ, Melbourne University and from UQ, University of Queensland, who are actually doing a survey at the moment of experts, mostly demographers, asking what they suspect immigration will look like. Based on that, they're going to run a series of projections at state and territory level and below to examine what those changes might mean for the future of Australia. So the research is in train, and we will see that research hopefully very soon. Thank you. I'm sure that will be very useful.
Oh, yes.
As an ex-teacher, you're always looking for those resources. Finally, we've got someone here who currently lives in a small rural town. I won't say where it is, but this person says it's home to a large Aboriginal mission. However, he perceives blatant racism from the elderly white population in particular, displayed towards traditional owners. And he feels that that's alive and well, and asks, what would your advice be with your specialty to help change the narrative as a young person who's in a leadership position?
Do you know what? I would ask the local First Nations populations what they would think. I know that yarning circles are a very powerful means of helping communicate and informing people. What's so concerning about matters of race is that we often leave it to minority groups to do the groundwork, to change our minds, tell us what you need, make it better. And that's really exhausting work. So, and I think it's a recognition that the people that perhaps the ones who are showing xenophobic or discriminatory views have grown up in a circumstance where that was normalized, that was okay. So on some fundamental level, they might believe that a eugenic kind of principle to life is right. It comes down to getting community together and finding ways for community to find commonalities. But research, it's pretty grim actually, because research does show that the more interaction someone has with different and opposing ethnicities can actually lead to greater discrimination. And so we've got to be careful to be led by evidence, but at the same time, not put the burden back on minority groups. Yarning circles, ask the local First Nations people what they think and how to move forward from there.
Can I also just add to that very quickly? It can very much depend on this, obviously on the location, but it can sometimes be unexpectedly helpful to try writing to your local council even. Oh, yeah. I have found, just in my experience doing advocacy, and I just want to absolutely second what Liz said, that the worst thing we can do as allies is just leave the fight to the people who are already suffering in that fight. And sometimes you can find allies at that sort of local council level, or certainly just local leaders, even in private industry, who are willing to just put their names for or against issues like that. And it can have a real impact in smaller communities.
They're the questions that we have for tonight, Bri, so I'll hand back to you.
Liz, I thank you so much for such a wonderful conversation. One thing that I just found so valuable about your book is that it just gave me all of this great data and all of these wonderful phrases and sentences that I can just pull out at my next, weird thing my uncle says, for example. And for anyone at home who is on the fence about whether or not to buy it, I'm sure hearing from Liz herself has convinced you. But I guess from me, the book is as conversational and accessible and entertaining as well as meaningful as Liz herself is. So please, round of applause wherever you are at home for Liz. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. And do you know what? Become a born-again demographer with me. Entry is free.
I love it. And of course, everyone, as Sam mentioned, we have a double book club this month. We will be hearing from Sanam Maher. She's joining us live from Karachi. And that is on Thursday, the 25th of June, to talk about this incredible book, A Woman Like Her, The Short Life of Kandil Balok. And big announcement, the book for July is the fantastic novel, A Lonely Girl is a Dangerous Thing, which is like exploding, crackling, fantastic debut Aussie fiction by Jessie Tu. The event bio for this event is not up online yet, but it will be on Thursday, the 16th of July. And it'll go online very soon. Of course, we'll share it everywhere where you normally find us. Thank you so much for joining us. Please be safe and have a lovely 2 weeks until I see you next. And thank you, Liz, and good night.